Hello trainers and welcome back to part 2 of the big Pokemon Go PvP catching guide. Today we'll finally talk about how to use your knowledge of energy management to actually catch moves. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I recommend checking out that one first, but as a super summary, if you want to learn about catching right away, last time we talked about how you want to recognize whether your charge moves are threatening or not, and if they are, recognizing the window of opportunity when you can throw them before your opponent. So the question you probably left the last video with is, why always talk about energy management? What does that have to do with catching? So without any beating around the bush, let's dive right into it. And the idea here is that while you use your own window of opportunity to recognize when you want to throw a charge move, you use your opponent's window of opportunity to recognize when you can catch a move. And if this concept of a window of opportunity is pretty new to you, this might sound overwhelming at first, because just last time I taught you about how to recognize your own window. Now I'm also asking you to recognize your opponent's window. But the good news is that if you are aware of your own window of opportunity, this automatically implies that, at least to some extent, you are also aware of your opponent's window. Because whenever your window ends, that is because your opponent's window starts. And your opponent's window ends because your next window starts, and so on. So I hope you're not bored of the pancake and the dragon that is not a dragon yet, because we will be using them as an example a lot again today. So, from Stanford's perspective, you know you can throw your first rock slide after either 5 or 6 mud shots, because the Charizard reaches the blast burn after 7 wing attacks, which means that after 7 wing attacks, the window of opportunity of the Charizard begins. Also, you reach your second rock slide after 10 mud shots, so that is when the window of opportunity of the Charizard ends, and so on. So, it's not like you have to analyze 2 windows at once and get that all in your brain, but rather, if you're comfortable with recognizing your own window, you'll automatically also be aware of your opponent's window. So that's pretty useful. So let's say you do recognize the window of opportunity and you want to make a catch. When exactly in your opponent's window do you make that catch attempt? And we'll start some easy cases. So for now, we'll assume that every charge move you can throw is threatening, and both you and your opponent are perfectly aware of each other's energy at all times. In practice, of course, this isn't very realistic, especially as the match goes on. But we'll start with these straightforward cases and then slowly expand to more complicated cases and more realistic cases, like being unsure of each other's energy after that. And we'll start with the most straightforward case possible, and that is when your opponent has a window of opportunity that is exactly 1 turn long. That would be when you and your opponent reach a charge move at the same time, but your opponent wins charge move priority. And one example for this would be from Stanford's perspective, after you got baited with 2 Dragon Claws, the Charizard reaches the blast burn at the exact same time that you reach your 3rd rock slide. So the Charizard is kind of forced to throw its blast burn immediately, because if it doesn't, you are able to throw the rock slide first and thus KO the Charizard and make it lose all of its energy. So if you recognize that the window of opportunity is exactly 1 turn long, it is very likely that your opponent will throw immediately, so it is very likely that you can make a catch. And the next best thing would be a window of opportunity that is 1 fast move long. And by that I mean that your opponent reaches a charge move just 1 fast move before you do, but they have a lower attack stat, so they don't really have to throw immediately. But if they do another fast move, you would also be at the charge move, you would be able to throw on charge move priority and thus throw first. And what is the difference between a 1 turn window and a 1 fast move window? And on a technical level, the difference is that a 1 fast move window is a window that is 2 turns long, at least in this case, because Mudshot and Wing Attacks are fast moves that take up 2 turns. So technically there is a difference, but functionally for most players it is the same, because typically you either throw immediately or you do another fast move, and because a fast move takes 2 turns, this ends your window of opportunity and you miss it. So you either throw immediately or you miss your window of opportunity. However, the technical difference that the 1 fast move window is 2 turns long is something to keep in mind for more advanced techniques that we will talk about later. So ideally, if your opponent has a window of opportunity that is either 1 turn or 1 fast move long, it is very likely that you can make a catch. But what is it like if your opponent has a window of opportunity that is bigger, which will very often be the case? And this shouldn't come as a surprise, but the bigger the window of opportunity is, the more difficult it becomes to make a catch. And this is where all your knowledge about good energy management comes into play, because if you're able to tell that your opponent has good energy management, they will likely throw at the end of their window of opportunity, so you can make a catch just then. And this is mostly true at the beginning of the game, generally in neutral matchups, and also when shields are up. your opponent will most likely be concerned mostly with having good energy management. So if you're staying in the matchup, Charizard against Stunfisk, this is not super comfortable from Charizard perspective, but it's also not super suspicious that you're staying in because you can win that matchup. So the Stunfisk will probably just throw his first Rock Slide after 6 mud shots, and if you go straight Blast Burn and they shield it, they will probably throw their second Rock Slide after 12 mud shots. However, things start to change when you're staying in a clearly negative matchup. So for example, if you have a Gliscor up against a Alolan Sandslash, your opponent will probably anticipate that you are up to something. And the keyword here is anticipation, because across all skill levels, if your opponent anticipates that you are about to make a catch attempt, they will probably adjust their strategy to make that catch less likely to happen. And one way your opponent might do that is by just being less predictable. And when throwing a charge move, there are 2 timings that are most predictable. That is either throwing immediately, because that is what a lot of unexperienced players do, or throwing as late as possible, because that is what most high-level players do. So most good players will avoid throwing immediately as long as they are aware of the window and their window doesn't force them to throw immediately. However, they are still likely to throw at the absolute latest possible point in time, because let's face it, in most cases it is a good strategy. So if they are aware at some point you will make a catch attempt, they just continue doing fast moves until your catch attempt happens, then they deal with the Pokemon you swapped in, and then finally they are able to land their charge move on the target they originally had. However, if you are also aware of this, you just also wait for the catch until the latest possible in time, which also again puts your opponent in a rough spot. So in contrast, an absolute top player will probably just be aware of that throwing at the absolute latest possible point in time is also predictable. So if their window of opportunity is big enough, they will probably not throw at the earliest and not at the latest possible point in time, but rather somewhere in between. And the examples we had so far, they could happen either at the beginning or at the end of the game. Let's talk a little bit about how things might be different, what you have to keep in mind when you really want to make a catch at the very end of the game, what might be different here. And on a theoretical level, of course, there is a small difference that there is no point throwing later because of energy management, because you can't take the energy into the next game. However, throwing as late as possible is still a valid strategy to avoid the catch from happening, because at some point your opponent will make the catch attempt and you just wait for it to happen. Also, the same thing applies if you throw at the absolute latest possible point in time. That is also predictable for top players. Either way, one key difference that is really different from catches at the beginning of the game is that it only matters who lands the decisive charge move when shields are down. So if you go into the final matchup of the game and both sides still have shields available, it doesn't really matter who throws the threatening charge move first while shields are still up, because it doesn't matter, it will be shielded no matter what. So the only time where the window of opportunity really matters is for the final charge move when shields are down. So if you want to make a catch at the final matchup of a game, typically you want to wait until shields are down, because only then your opponent will really care about whether they can throw before you or not. So regardless if we're on the final matchup or at the beginning of the game, of course, when you want to make a catch, you would prefer if your opponent has a very small window of opportunity, because that makes your chances higher of the catch being successful. And one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you can control that window of opportunity and you can shrink it, for example, with a bait. And a good example for this, once again, would be the matchup Charizard against Galarian Stunfisk. If from the perspective of Charizard you want to catch the first Rock Slide, that Rock Slide has a window of opportunity that is 2 fast moves long. So it's still kind of likely that you can make a catch, however it's not ideal. If, however, you are able to land a bait with a Dragon Claw, the second Rock Slide has a window of opportunity that is only 1 fast move long, so that makes a catch much more likely. However, one counterpoint to keep in mind here is that landing a charge move is much more crucial when shields are down, because in most cases KOing a Pokemon has more impact than taking a shield from your opponent. So if your opponent has a very small window of opportunity to throw a charge move, but shields are still up, they might think, I'm afraid of a catch, I will not throw immediately, even if that means I miss my window of opportunity, because having to invest in extra shield might be less punishing than you making a catch. So because of that, they might not throw immediately, even if that makes them miss their window of opportunity. So, as a quick summary here, a catch is most likely to work when A, your opponent has a very small window of opportunity, and B, shields are down. When the window is small but shields are still up, a catch is still somewhat likely to work. You just need to be aware that some players will prefer to miss their window of opportunity rather than have a catch happen. So, next thing to talk about are all the special cases we talked about in the last video that can clip your opponent's window of opportunity. So let's talk about those. The first special case we talked about is reaching 100 energy, so if you're up against a Stunfisk and it already did 11 Mudshot, it's very likely that it will throw a charge move next, because an extra Mudshot would generate pretty much no energy, and also Mudshots always deal almost no damage, so it's very likely the Stunfisk will throw a move, and then you can catch it. The next thing to consider is when you can KO your opponent with fast moves. So if, for example, you have a Medicham up against a Swampert and you keep doing counters, but you know that Swampert has a Hydro Cannon stored, when the next counter will KO the Swampert, you can catch it because the Swampert will have to throw it. The third special case we talked about in the last video is when you have a Pokemon with high fast move pressure, for example with Charm, in which case your opponent might prioritize taking high HP into the next matchup rather than high energy, so they will throw a little earlier than at the end of their window of opportunity. There's also one special case we did not talk about last week, and that is when your opponent switches into a better matchup and you do not immediately make a counter swap, in which case your opponent is somewhat likely to throw immediately because they might think, okay, you are not sure what counter swap to make, you are still thinking about it, so if they throw immediately they can gain an advantage. So if you predict they throw immediately, you gain some energy on the Pokemon you originally had on the field, and you also make the catch. There's also one extra reason why your opponent might very likely be to throw a charge move immediately, and that is making up the turn they lost for the swap. So if you have a Swampert up against a Galarian Stunfisk and your opponent switches into their own Swampert, if they are able to throw the Hydro Cannon immediately and you do not throw a charge move and you do not make a catch, they are able to make up the turn they lost at the beginning. So of course there's a lot of special cases here, so my advice would be don't try everything at once. Just if this thing of catching is pretty new to you, before you try to keep every special case in mind, start with the easy things. Start to recognize your opponent's counts, try to recognize likely timings, make catches, and when you're comfortable with that, slowly expand to more cases. So let's take a quick break here and have a quick summary what we learned so far, under the assumption that you and your opponent are aware of each other's energy at all times. What you want to do, you want to recognize your opponent's window of opportunity to throw a charge move and typically make a catch at the latest possible point in that window of opportunity. And when it's very obvious that you might go for a catch, you should make the catch a little earlier, because your opponent might recognize that throwing as late as possible is also predictable. And now, finally, let's talk about what about the more realistic cases when either you or your opponent are not 100% sure of the energy counts of each other. So let's start with the case that you do know the counts, but you think maybe your opponent does not. And as we talked about last time, what this does for your opponent is it creates a perceived window of opportunity that might be smaller than the actual window of opportunity. So your opponent might throw earlier than they would have to, which makes your chances of making a catch bigger because they have less opportunities to throw the charge move. So if once again we take a look at the matchup Charizard against Galarian Stunfisk, from the perspective of Charizard, you did one Blast Burn and one Dragon Claw bait, and it is a total of 17 wing attacks until you reach the next Blast Burn. So if you're saying your opponent is perfectly aware of this count, you make the prediction that they will throw the Rock Slide one wing attack before you reach the Blast Burn, so after 16 wing attacks. However, if you think your opponent might be unsure and they might think it's only 16 wing attacks total, you would predict that they will throw their Rock Slide immediately because they want to be safe and throw it a little earlier than they would have to. The question here, of course, is how do you tell if your opponent is unsure of energy or not? And there are several methods that you can use to recognize how certain your opponent is with their energy. So let's start with talking about potential sources of uncertainty. So if your opponent generally does know the counts, what might impact them that they are suddenly unsure? And the first source of uncertainty is complicated counts. We already talked a lot about the matchup Charizard against Galarian Stunfisk. For the Charizard, it becomes very difficult to memorize all of the counts. You probably know that the first Blast Burn is 7 wing attacks, the first Dragon Claw bait is 5 wing attacks, and everything after that can be pretty difficult. How many wing attacks is 1 Dragon Claw bait and 1 Blast Burn? How many wing attacks is 3 Blast Burns, and so on. The next potential source of uncertainty is swaps. So if you stay in with your first Pokemon, your opponent counts the fast move of that Pokemon and then you swap to a different Pokemon. Now your opponent has to remember the count of the first Pokemon and also start counting the energy of the new Pokemon. And when you swap in the first Pokemon later, they might have forgotten how much energy it was at. Another potential source is one-turn moves, because just generally for most players it is very difficult to count one-turn moves, especially when both sides have a one-turn move. But for most players, even if they have a 2-turn move or 3-turn move, it is still pretty difficult to have the exact count of a 1-turn move. Next up we have unusual Pokemon. So if you're running a Pokemon that is very rarely seen in PvP, your opponent might have no idea at all what the counts of that Pokemon are or even what charge moves it might be running. And this also leads us to a strategy that might create uncertainty for your opponent, and that is continuously overfarming. So if you overfarm the first charge move that might not yet be threatening a little bit, then also overfarm the next charge move a little bit. This might throw your opponent's counts off, so they might think maybe I miscounted. Then when you throw the next charge move immediately, that might surprise them, which might be pretty useful when shields are down. So these are potential sources of uncertainty, but how do you recognize how these affect your opponent? And what you want to do here is you want to recognize patterns in your opponent's gameplay. So if you have an unexperienced player, you might recognize that they always throw their charge move immediately. So if they do it with the first 2 charge moves, even if it doesn't matter when they throw them, this will likely persist later in the game. So they will likely also throw their charge move immediately at the end where it's more decisive. If your opponent always throws as late as possible, they likely have good energy management. And this is something you can recognize even if you don't know the counts yourself. So if you recognize with the first 2 or 3 charge moves, your opponent always throws on charge move priority or always throws right before you reach your own charge move, this is a very strong sign that they know the counts perfectly well and always optimize their energy. And you can recognize that your opponent might be affected by potential sources of uncertainty if their timing is perfect at the beginning of the game, but as the match goes on, it becomes less and less optimal. So they throw the first charge move as late as possible, then after a swap they throw 1 or 2 fast moves earlier than they would have to, and then later on they start throwing immediately because they completely lost track of energy. So you recognize these patterns, how does the timing of your opponent develop over the course of the game, and then use this to predict how unsure or sure they are of their energy. Of course, the problem here is that to some extent, even if you do recognize that your opponent is unsure of the energy, it can still be a little of a guessing game of how unsure they are of the energy. So if you do recognize that your opponent has a window of opportunity that is 5 fast moves long, and you also recognize that your opponent is most likely unsure of the energy, it can still be pretty difficult to tell if they will throw 1, 2 or 3 fast moves earlier than they would have to. However, if your opponent's window is already small to begin with, it is very likely that you can make a catch. So if the window of opportunity is 2 fast moves long in reality, and you recognize your opponent might not realize this, they are very likely to throw immediately, which makes a catch very likely to work. So now we've talked about what to do when your opponent is unsure of the energy, but what do you do when you are unsure of the energy but you still want to make a catch? And as we've already talked about, you can recognize that your opponent has very good energy management even without being aware of the counts by seeing that your opponent always throws on charge move priority or 1 turn before charge move priority. And if you recognize that, you can make a catch without knowing the counts. So if you see your opponent always throws on charge move priority, you just make a catch attempt when you reach a charge move yourself. Or if you have a higher attack stat than your opponent, you make the catch 1 turn before you would reach the charge move. However, of course, you won't always face against opponents with perfect energy management, but you still might want to make a catch, and what are strategies that might help you in a more general case. And generally, as we've talked about, when you want to throw your own charge move and you are unsure of your window of opportunity, you want to throw a little earlier to be safe. However, if you want to make a catch and you are unsure of your opponent's energy, you generally want to make the catch attempt a little later than you feel the opponent might reach a charge move, because if you make the catch attempt before your opponent even reaches a charge move, it is very unlikely to work, because your opponent will most likely have enough time to react to the catch attempt and not throw the charge move and make a counter swap or whatever might help them in that case. However, if you make the catch attempt a little later, if you think my opponent should already have reached the charge move 2 fast moves ago, and then you make the catch attempt even though your opponent only just reached the charge move, that catch attempt might work if your opponent does throw immediately. So once again, let's have a summary how to deal with uncertainty. First, you want to watch out for patterns in your opponent's gameplay to recognize how sure or unsure they are about your energy. And if you recognize that they might be unsure of the energy, you make the catch a little earlier than you would if you think the opponent has perfect energy management. If you yourself are unsure of your opponent's energy, you typically want to make the catch attempt a little later than you think the opponent reaches the charge move, because A catch that is too late is more likely to work than a catch that is too early. So let us make a cut here and reflect what we talked about so far. In the first video we talked about energy management and how you want to time your charge moves optimally. Today we talked about how you can use your knowledge about energy management to predict when your opponent throws a charge move, to catch their moves, and also to recognize whether your opponent has that optimal charge move timing or not. If this is all pretty new to you, I definitely recommend taking some time practicing all of the things we talked about, because it definitely takes some time to master. And after you are pretty well at those two things, the next step would be optimizing your charge move timing in a way that you are not predictable for your opponent. So that is what we'll talk about in the next video.